All right, so some of you guys might know our next presenter. Mike Grogan is a meteorologist with KOTV News on 6, but he also serves on the board of directors of Disaster Resilience Network and as a co-chair of their cross-cultural council, where he speaks to a number of diverse groups throughout the city to spread life-saving disaster information. He does his work with other amazing community champions that he would like to tell you about today. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Emeka. All right, I'm very excited to represent the Disaster Resilience Network, and it's a bit of a natural fit for someone who's a meteorologist to do so. Our goal of the DRN is to empower people, businesses, and communities to reduce the impacts of disaster, many of which are weather-related. Now, within the DRN is the Disaster Resilience Cross-Cultural Council. I'll call it the DRCCC for short today. And that's what I want to tell you about and how we're reaching out to different cultural groups throughout our city to spread disaster preparedness information. So within the DRCCC, we treat disaster preparedness a little bit like evangelism, and storytelling is a model for effectively sharing life-saving information to all people. This is especially important for more vulnerable groups. The reason is disasters don't discriminate. We're all about partnership. TCC partnered with us to create some awesome videos done in a number of different languages, which is a basis for our seminars to accomplish the goal of reaching others. We found community champions in English, Spanish, Burmese or Zomi, Urdu, Arabic, and Russian-speaking communities, all who have a unique story of surviving disaster and a desire to share lessons learned from those particular disasters. And we wanted to not only focus on the different cultural groups, but other people that might be overlooked as well when it comes to disaster preparedness, like the ASL community. So we've already reached out with them and partnered with them to also spread that information their way to their unique needs. So these seminars were often initiated and set up by various community groups showing an obvious interest and need for the information. And here was a group from St. Thomas More Church in East Tulsa, and we had spoken to hundreds of people. That was one of the groups that evening, most of whom were Spanish speakers. And within that community, we learned that there was a big misconception about where you go in the case of a tornado. Many of them would leave homes and go to places like Walmart or Home Depot. In the case of the Joplin tornado, it was far from a safe place. A large building doesn't make it sturdy, as we know, and their designated shelter was never intended as a community one. And this example came very true in May of 2013, the tornado that hit the Oklahoma City area. A Guatemalan family left their home, sought shelter in a large drainage ditch under a bridge, and the family left their perfectly built house. It was never hit by the tornado, but floodwaters raced down the ditch, and it swept all 7 members of their family away to their death. It was a tragedy felt in both Guatemala and here in Oklahoma. And someone who knew that family well was Hilda De Leon. She was a champion who told this emotional story as a plea to shelter in place whenever possible. The consequences of not doing so, we know, are deadly. But her authenticity and her warmth, it lent credence to a message in a way, a story in which we could never tell in the way she could. So we realized even those quite familiar with this message need to hear it in English as well. And we found Pastor Phipps, a pastor in North Tulsa, as a perfect champion for us. You might remember a few years ago, we had the March 31st tornado that hit North Tulsa. It ruined and damaged a lot of buildings in that community. So he was holding a choir practice when this tornado struck, and it hit his church, and even as members of their congregation were racing in seconds before debris was falling all around them, and you see the damage there, it was left in ruins, and many folks had avoided injury and death just by a few seconds. It was a close call and a scary one for their congregation. Well, being a man of God, Pastor Phipps spoke on the basis of faith versus presumption. What he meant by that was that God would not want to put ourselves at risk when common sense would say otherwise. Adding a spiritual element of his message, though, reached people to a greater depth once and again in a way that an organization like us couldn't on our own. Finally, there was a Russian story, a very special one to us. It was a testimony about surviving a house fire or an apartment fire, the one you see here in 2001. So a Russian member of our council introduced us to Eduard Loboda. He was a strong community champion who was so passionate about his experience that he conveyed his message of surviving the disaster in the form of a poem. But actually, shortly after we taped this, after we taped his and reading his poem, he had passed away. And so we met with this congregation at First Slavic Baptist Church in Tulsa, And the reading of his poem and the video created, it turned into a tribute to his life, in addition to an important plea to trust emergency officials and heed all precautions. So these are three of the heart-wrenching stories that turned around to be beacons of good news, that any of us can be prepared for disaster, and that no one should be left without that life-saving information, especially here in a city known for its wild weather. And since we know disasters don't discriminate, our goal is to make sure our life-saving good news does not do so either. That is just the start of our efforts, though. Our council is not just diverse in culture, it's diverse in professions and walks in life. And so we're using that network in a means to reach others and create new paths to reaching others when disasters strike in Tulsa and there beyond. Thank you.